One more guest coming your way here today. That is the great Rolf Michaels from WagerTalk.com. Rolf, how's it going today, man?
Going great, Adam. Good morning. And, well, it's not Thursday. Very, very pleased to be on with you today.
Yeah, and you will be joining us again on Thursday. We'll chat college basketball with you there, but you're helping me out here with some college football stuff on Tuesday, and I certainly do appreciate that. One of the things I know you wanted to talk about here, and I'm actually kind of looking around on Twitter as we're going to discuss this, bowl games, 39 of them, so we got 78 spots out there for 6-win teams. We've got a chance of possibly getting 81 or 82 6-win teams here, so I know that's something that you wanted to talk about a little bit.
Well, it is. Last year we went through the process of the highest APR with 5 wins getting in. This year that won't be the case. You know, we have 79 bowl-eligible teams. Number 80 would be Ole Miss. They, of course, self-imposed themselves with a bowl ban this year, so despite being 6-6, they won't be bowling. I am going to make the assumption Florida State is going to beat ULM. That would make number 80. And then the other favorite that's playing this week is New Mexico State. New Mexico State is a 10-point favorite at home against South Alabama. They sit at 5-6, and they're in a spot. You know, while we're going to be over the allotted bowl slots, and there's going to be some teams that won't be going bowling, New Mexico State knows if they win that game, they will go to a bowl. The Sun Belt has 6 bowl affiliations. They would make the 6th team to become bowl eligible. So for them, it's not let's try to get to 6 wins and see what happens. They're going to be in. The other 5-6 team that has a possibility is Louisiana Lafayette. They're a 15-point dog to Appalachian State on Saturday. So we're looking at, you know, I'm going to guess 81 teams for the 78 spots, and that leaves 3 teams out high and dry. And really, you look at the 3 teams, and you're probably going to go to the bottom of the MAC and the bottom of the Sun Belt. So those teams in jeopardy this year, Western Michigan and Buffalo, are both 6-6. And as I said, you would normally go to the Sun Belt, but with them filling their affiliations, we now have to go to CUSA, where we have 6-6 teams of Western Kentucky, Middle Tennessee, La Tech, and UTSA. So fans of those 6 schools, 3 of you most probably are going to be left out. We'll see what happens. We know the MAC has pulled some great surprises the last few years, getting some bowls to take a horrible 6-6 MAC team by promising a few extra dollars and the conference changing some of their obligations down the road. So it'll be up to the commissioners now of the conferences to pull some strings to get some of those teams in.
And one of the saddest things I think about bowl season, and I love all the bowl games. I love that these kids get to go to different destinations, maybe some places they'd never go to, like the teams that get to go to the Bahamas Bowl or the Hawaii Bowl or something like that. They get to pack a stuff. They get to go through, you know, whatever functions are planned for them, all the dinners and all the sponsorship stuff and all that. It's great for these kids to have that experience. But the one thing I hate is that you have situations, and you and I were talking about this a little bit yesterday, with a team like New Mexico State. They haven't been to a bowl game since 1960. They should win this week, and I certainly hope that they do. But their athletic director's already come out and said, if we're not placed locally, we probably have to turn it down because it's just too much of a financial strain for us. You know, we see that sometimes with the NIT and the CBI and the CIT, for those postseason tournaments in college basketball. That's a shame. I feel like there should be a slush fund or a contingency fund or something for those teams to be able to get that experience. So hopefully New Mexico State does win and winds up in Albuquerque or somewhere in Texas or Arizona, something like that, maybe even California. But it is a shame that those kids play so hard for that chance to get to the postseason, to have that experience, and then the athletic departments just can't afford it.
You know, and I agree, and it's going to take the commissioner some work. Now, here's the question. How much work will the Sun Belt commissioner put into helping a New Mexico State team, which will not be part of their conference next year?
Probably none.
But again, if they do, then it's going to be them having to make a change. I know the New Mexico would probably be excited. We know the New Mexico Bowl's taken the Lobos for all those years, so why not take the Aggies this year? But it would take an affiliation change of the Sun Belt trading one of their bowls to the New Mexico Bowl and getting a Mountain West rep in, or getting a West Coast team into the Camellia Bowl or the Dollar General Bowl, which isn't bad anyway. I mean, how many Sun Belt and MAC teams can those guys see down in Mobile, Alabama every year? Changing it up would be exciting for the communities, would be exciting for the bowls, and that's the problem with some of those allegiances. You have bottom end, lower conference teams of the same groupings every year that change is exciting for everybody. So I'm with you. While you can pay the kids, I don't know what the stipend is now. The bowl's allowed to pay the kids $350 per in their gifts. How much harder would it be for the bowl just to step up and say, okay, let's just pay for their airfare and hotels as well. And, a bowl works both ways. There's a lot of times that some of these teams go to bowls because they promise to buy more tickets than another team. If you say we're going to guarantee a bowl to buy 10,000 tickets, which is the case New Mexico State probably can't play, because most of these bowls have a minimum that you have to purchase, and if you don't sell them, then the school's forced to pay that extra amount themselves. So, the bowls are great for all those top teams. It's the struggling teams at the bottom that struggle to do this. And the bowls are a huge deal. I mean, the bowls for the kids, as you said, is a great thing. But, I'm going to go back and really show my age. And back when the Sun Belt only had 1 or 2 bowl berths per year, I mean, North Texas was just the best team in the conference because every year they won that conference. They got the 15 extra bowl practices. They had all that extra time to work. They had all the extra exposure to recruit. And year in and year out, by just making it to the bowl, they were by far a superior team in the conference. We don't get that as much with all the bowl teams now, but just an example how those bowl practices help. And the coaches will tell you that. I mean, it is invaluable having your young kids work in December and then getting the extra work for all the kids going into the bowl.
No, I absolutely agree with everything you said. And the one last point I'll make is if you get a team like New Mexico State in a bowl game, they're going to show up and play. They're going to be so excited to be there, they're going to play. And we talk all the time about motivation in these bowl games, and that'll be a drinking game buzzword for our listeners here over the next several weeks of the season. But you have these teams that just go to these bowl games and just don't give a shit. They just don't. They mail it in as much as they possibly can because these kids they're done. They don't want to play anymore. And, sometimes you may run into a situation where that team that doesn't want to be there is taking a bowl spot from a team that would die to be there. So, it's such a tough situation, obviously, but, that would be the argument I would make for the people that say, oh, there are too many bowls. I think there should be more bowls. I think all these kids should have this opportunity because for a lot of these kids, especially the seniors, this is it for them. Their football careers are over, unless they go coach or something like that. So, the more the merrier as far as I'm concerned, especially from a handicapping standpoint too.
I think it shows that we're at the right number now because last year we struggled to fill them. This year we're 1 or 2 over. So that puts us in the area of if you're a 6-6 team, then you can continue your season. And again, while some teams tank it in, those 6-6 teams, we'll talk about bowl strategies later. When you have a 6-6 team, coaching, staff, players from top to bottom, it's a huge difference finishing that season 7-6 compared to 6-7 and going into next year on a winning note. So I agree with you. Those 6-6 teams aren't one of those cases where teams usually aren't motivated.
All right, well, let's look at some of these Week 14 games. We'll have plenty of time to talk about all the bowls that are coming up because, as we mentioned, there are a lot of them. We'll try to cover every single one of them here on the shows as we go throughout the month of December and then on into January. Let's start with the first game on the board here on Saturday, game 305-306. Idaho takes on Georgia State. Georgia State a 4-point favorite in this game. Now, this is a really interesting game. I know you like to do a lot of situational handicapping. Georgia State has 6 wins. They're 6-4, but it might be in their best interest to go ahead and win this game just in case they are one of those 6-win teams kept out of a bowl spot. And then they take on this Idaho team. Idaho playing its last game as an FBS member. They have nothing to play for in this game. They're 3-8. They can't get bowl eligibility, anything like that. But it's their last game in FBS. And you got to think that you kind of want to go out on top, so to speak. So I think this is a really compelling handicap.
Well, the teams are a complete reversal of each other. Georgia State started 0-2. They lost to Tennessee State and Penn State. They turned the ball over 9 times the first 2 games. Since that time, they're +6 turnovers and they're 6-2. Their only losses against Troy and against Appalachian State, two of the top teams in the Sun Belt. Georgia State has nobody statistically that's great, running the ball. Their top rusher, Glenn Smith, is averaging 3.4 yards per carry and 442 yards. Connor Manning, a nice quarterback, 64%, a 13-7 ratio. Penny Hart, their receiver, is the only player on the offensive side that has potential to move on to the next level. He has 1,000 yards and 70 receptions, but they don't do anything great. Besides ULM, where they had 670 yards, and Texas State, their top production is 369 yards. Their defense gives up more than they're allowing, by 13 yards per game, but they just don't turn the ball over. They don't make mistakes, and they win games. Now, you look at Idaho. Idaho has come in. They won their opener against Sacramento State, and they are 2-8 the rest of the way out, including being 1-6 their last 6 games. They're playing a third road game in 4 weeks. Matt Linehan, their all-conference quarterback, who has a 16-4 ratio, got shut down a few weeks ago with an injury. Last week they go into New Mexico State. They start Mason Petrino, their second-string quarterback, who had played 1 game. He got hurt. He's knocked out. And then they had to go to true freshman Colton Richardson. So for me, I clearly am on the Georgia State side. You're going to have a potential freshman quarterback making his first road start, and you're playing a third road game in 4 weeks. You are devastated on the year. Idaho, all 7 losses this year in Sun Belt play have been by 7 points or less, and their last 5 Sun Belt losses by a combined 24 points, so under 5 points per game. They're close every week. They lose every week. That's frustrating. That can nag on a team. Now they're playing their last Sun Belt game. They'll be going down a step to the FCS, playing in the Big Sky next year, where they will be competitive immediately. And Georgia State, again, is a team that has won 3 of their last 4. Their only loss, App State. I like Georgia State in this situation.
Yeah, I think so too. I think that you're really on the right track there with that game, even though you can make a case, like I said, for Idaho wanting to win that last FBS game, but also, maybe it's better for Idaho to look ahead because, as you mentioned, they'll be competitive in the Big Sky right away. Much, much easier travel. It's brutal for a team like Idaho to have to go down and play in Georgia or play in South Carolina and in Conway there against Coastal, or, to go down to Texas. All those trips are really taxing on players, especially in the midst of a bad year. So being up there in the Big Sky and playing local teams, I think that's something that they're looking forward to. It may be one of those things where actually last FBS game is more of a sigh of relief thing than anything else.
Well, it was a long season. The expectations were high. You started off, you lose to UNLV, you lose to Western Michigan, and then you're close. Again, 5-point loss to Louisiana, 3-point loss to App State, 3-point loss to Troy, 6-point loss to Coastal, 7-point loss to New Mexico State. Now you're on your third-string quarterback. If you had your senior back for a final game and he was trying to break records, I think they could come out and have some excitement. A young quarterback making his first start on the road in an unusual setting is hard for me to back. And that's, I'm always one to play against freshman quarterbacks making their first road start. And while he came in last week and he was 18 of 33 last week, there's a different mentality for a young quarterback. If your quarterback gets hurt and you're coming in, all of a sudden the adrenaline kicks in. You're not thinking about anything. You're just going out with a simplified playbook, and you play the game well. Now you have a week of prep with the ones, and you're trying to learn the playbook better, and you're trying to pick up blitzes, and there's so much more involved when you know you're going to be the starting quarterback compared to coming in and playing. The one thing, while we all assume Idaho will be competitive next year, and I haven't found this out, and I'll throw this out to the listeners. If anyone knows, shoot me a DM on Twitter and let me know. Idaho obviously will have to drop back in scholarships going down a step, and I haven't been able to find out. I've emailed a few people within that program, and no one's gotten back to me. Does that mean Idaho just can't sign any class this year to get down to the FCS level? Or I don't know if they have a step process where perhaps they're allowed to sign some kids this year and fewer the next. So, that's a question I'm going to leave open, and I'll try to find out next time as we talk. But, we always talk about coming up in steps, how you're adding scholarships as you go. Yeah, Idaho could be not so competitive next year if they're going to be losing 11 starters and they can't sign anyone to their class because they're at their scholarship limit for an FCS level.
Well, that's a really good point. I didn't even think about that, and hopefully someone out there can give us a little bit of direction on what that process is like, and like you, I'll look into it here as well. Let's go to game 319-320, the MAC championship game. Akron takes on Toledo. Toledo opened an 18.5-point favorite, but this number is blown all the way through 21, up to 21.5. BetOnline, the only one holding at 21 with -15 on the favorite. But 21.5 at DSI, Bookmaker, Penny, 5 dimes all over the place. I mean, you don't see many 3-touchdown lines in conference championship games.
Yeah, and, it's deserved. I still like the dog in this one, but I can understand why. Just because we don't know what Thomas Woodson did, where Thomas Woodson is, or what he did to the coach's daughter. I say that kiddingly, but, he has just fallen off the wayside. He was suspended 3 games ago, and now all of a sudden, if you read the Akron write-up on this game, it talks about Thomas Woodson being their leading quarterback, having this many yards and doing this, but he hasn't had game action in a few weeks, and they've already announced that Cato Nelson is going to start. Cato Nelson's a dual threat freshman who's played a few games, and look, he's come in, he's beat Ohio. They had a 443 to 395 yard edge. That was at home. And then he beat Kent State at home 24-14. But that's what concerns me. In his first true start at home with prep time against Kent State, Akron could manage 191 yards and 15 first downs. He was 6 of 20 passing for 69 yards, and he was sacked 6 times. So with the young quarterback in, Akron has allowed 12 sacks in their last 3 games. Toledo's not a huge sack team, but when you have Logan Woodside as your quarterback, who 24-3 ratio this year, he's completing 65% of his passes. You've got a 1,200-yard rusher in Terry Swanson, is averaging 5.4 yards per carry. And then, by the way, you have Shaquille Seymour right behind him, 670 yards, 6.3 yards per carry. They each have 12 first downs. You have a 1,200-yard receiver in Deontay Johnson averaging 18.1 yards per carry. And your next 2 receivers have over 500 yards, and they're averaging 16.3 and 19.2 yards per carry. First game this year was 48-21. Toledo was at home. They had a 626 to 333 yard edge. Last week, in their final game, with really nothing to prove, they mauled Western Michigan with a 455 to 275 yard edge. I'm going to say, go out on the limb and say Toledo will put up 40 to 45 points in this game. So if you're going to back Akron, you're going to have to say Akron's going to at least reach the mid-20s. So that's where I put the game. And originally why I said when I started this conversation saying I might lean Akron with the 21, I'm going to come off that a little bit now as talking myself through this with the game. Hadn't done much prep work on this game prior to our phone conversation. Looking at what Toledo's done, they put up 600 yards in 5 of their last 7 games. They're averaging 543 yards per game. You're going to have the crowd edge. I am going to now back off my original statement and say that I'd probably look at Toledo or start looking at the total.
See, I like that you did that, and for our listeners, it may sound a little bit skeptical to have a little bit of a statement there at the beginning and then walk your way back through it. But I completely understand what that point of view is like, because I do a ton of writing for BangTheBook.com. I wrote 177 articles last month, and one of the things that's nice about all the writing that I do is that I can process my thoughts. It's one thing to look at my power ratings, put together my number, compare it to the number that's out there in the market. If there's line value, obviously I can take a look and play it. If there's not line value, maybe I put that game on the back burner a little bit. But one of the things that does really help me from all the writing that I do is that I can walk through these games. I can process all the information, see if there's something that my power ratings aren't telling me, and believe me, there's always something that my power ratings aren't telling me. So, like you, my initial thoughts on this game were Akron, and from a power rating standpoint, my number is lower. My number is more like the number that we saw for the game in Toledo that was 15 on October 21st. My number is, I think, 15.5 or 16, something like that, and this is a neutral site game. So, I've still made adjustments to both of these teams to bump them up. Maybe Toledo gets a half point or a point edge because Toledo's closer to Detroit than Akron is, but I don't think that's really a big deal here in this spot. So I think the number is too high. The problem is, like you said, you're asking an Akron offense that generally isn't very good to try and keep pace with an offense that is extremely efficient and has been extremely efficient for several years in a row now. I mean, it got Matt Campbell a job at Iowa State. It's going to get Jason Candle a job somewhere else. Toledo's just a really, really good football team. So you see a number like this, you're tempted to play the dog. Maybe I'll look to play the dog live. But pregame position on Akron, based on my numbers and based on the fact that no conference championship game should be this high, when you start talking through it and dig a little bit deeper, it all does start to make sense.
And, when I think that's an important, we haven't talked about this much, but, I do this in every game, and, you heard me just basically, this is a game I didn't have interest in. I didn't look in. My first reaction was the points are too high, but then this is how I handicap games, going through the process we just did. So, again, I don't want people to think I was betting this game already. It was just my gut reaction was the line's too high to take the points. But when you're handicapping a game, it's very important to put a realistic score out. You should be predicting the score. Because if you have an unrealistic expectation, will Toledo get to 40? Yeah, I would bet Toledo would get to 40. And then you're looking at can Akron get to 20? And all of a sudden, that's not such a good statement to make because they had 21 at Toledo, 21 at Buffalo in the regular season. That was with Thomas Woodside. Their last two games, if you cannot run the ball and you're one-dimensional against Toledo's defense, Toledo's got a decent defense. I mean, they're allowing 378 yards per carry, but they're only allowing 54% on the year. Those are Alabama and Ohio State type numbers. When you're under 55% and you're a mid-level and you're a MAC team, those are incredible numbers. So 53.8% passing against a freshman quarterback with a D-line that's allowing under 5 yards per carry and has done much better down the stretch. It starts me looking towards the Rocket. One note on this game off the cuff is the MAC championship for I don't know how many years since it started has always been played on Friday night up in Detroit. This year they moved it to play Saturday at noon, so it's going to be going head-to-head with three other conference championships. I bet the handle on this game is 1/10 of what it has been the last few years, being a standalone Friday game on ESPN prior to the Pac-12 championship, instead of now being one of 9 or 10 games on noon on Saturday and one of three conference championships.
Yeah, I agree, and also the line's going to deter some people away from taking this one as well. So I think that that's definitely an astute observation there by you. Let's talk about a real big game here. Georgia, Auburn. The winner of this game goes to the college football playoff. Doesn't matter who it is. Georgia's a 2.5-point dog here. There are some twos out there at the Greek and Bet Online, DSI, Bookmaker, Bovada, all 2.5 here. First thing I want to ask you about in terms of this game. So this one is being played in Atlanta. How much of a home field adjustment are you giving Georgia for this game?
Well, I'm not. This is a game where, I could maybe give them 1 point, but this is Atlanta. This is their area. That's Georgia Tech. That the Atlanta people basically hate Georgia. Athens to Georgia isn't that far, but the rivalry they just played at Georgia Tech last week, the people in Atlanta are mostly Georgia Tech fans and don't like Georgia. Now, granted, they played at Georgia Tech last week. Again, not the same stadium. This is the new Mercedes-Benz Stadium that the Falcons play in. So you don't have familiarity with the stadium. Neither team does. And Atlanta is such a hotbed for the SEC. Auburn's going to bring their fans. Auburn's going to sell out every ticket they have possible. So because the tickets are split 50-50, because you're although you're playing in your same state, it's not like you're surrounded that every fan is going to be wearing the Georgia red and black, that I don't think there's an edge in this one.
All right, so you got Auburn then a 2.5 point favorite, down from an opener of 3 where there was a little bit of extra juice on Georgia, at least at Bookmaker when they opened. What do you think of the number? I mean, is this number correct in your mind?
It is. We talked about this game, casually yesterday, and I'm on the belief that I would have made Auburn 3. I think Auburn has edges on both offense and defense, and that's tough to say because the Georgia defense is so good. But I like looking at what teams have done compared to averages. Everything is relative when you look at yards. I mean, you look at Big 12 teams, and if you're not putting up 550 yards, you're probably under your season average. When you get into the SEC teams, sometimes you're looking at 300 yards is average. And I look at what Georgia and Auburn have both done against their opponents this year. Georgia is averaging 68 yards more than their opponents allow. So, an example, last week against Georgia Tech, Georgia put up 471 yards. That's 128 yards more than Georgia Tech normally allows. So, Georgia's a middle-of-the-road team. They're plus 68 yards on offense. Auburn is the number 6 team in the country. They're plus 104 yards per game over what their opponent allows on the year, and that includes that Clemson game back in week 2 where they only had 117 yards, or else Auburn would be the number 1 offensive team gaining more yards than their opponent allows. When you look on the defensive side, these teams are number 4 and number 5, almost identical. And, the eye test, I like that Auburn D-line. There's 4 guys that can get off on that ball, that can cause havoc in the pass rush, that can stop the run. Auburn allowing 3.3 yards per carry on the year, Georgia allowing 3.5. Auburn's defense allowing 54% on the year, Georgia 56%. So you have Jarrett Stidham, Jake Fromm. I'm going to take Jarrett Stidham. The only question in this, you have Chubb and Michelle, 2,100 yards. You have Kerryon Johnson, 1,200 yards. Kerryon Johnson went off last week, banged up, did not come back and finish that game. It was late. It was in the fourth quarter. My number of 3 and my opinion on Georgia is hearing a verification that Kerryon Johnson is healthy and will play and is very, very close to 100%. My attitude completely changes if they have to go to Cam Martin and Cameron Petaway. I mean, they're fine. Those 2 backs have combined for 700 yards and 5.3 yards per carry. But having Kerryon on in there and being able to get first downs on short yardage, night and day difference. So everything I said is predicated on Kerryon Johnson playing, Kerryon Johnson at least 90%. Otherwise, it's a game where I won't flip to Georgia. I won't flip my allegiances, but my line would certainly become affected by 1, 1.5, maybe 2 points. And being one-dimensional going into the game, I prefer the 2-dimensional team, which would then give the edge with the Chubb-Michelle rush attack, Jake Fromm throwing. I mean, Jake Fromm, hats off to him, 19-5 ratio. I mean, very, very solid. But to me, Stidham looks more comfortable in a big game situation like he did last week.
So what's really challenging for me about this game is my number is 1.5. But part of the problem with that, and this is something you kind of run into a little bit with a team like Wisconsin, is that the SEC East is much weaker than the SEC West. I know South Carolina won 8 games, and they were ranked last week going into that Clemson matchup. They're not that great of a team. Missouri came on at the end of the year. They played well. Down year for Florida. Vanderbilt got beaten in 7 of its 8 SEC games. Tennessee didn't win an SEC game. Kentucky's kind of a middle-of-the-road team. So you have to respect Georgia from a power rating standpoint. You have to put them up there because their numbers are going to be higher against these inferior foes. Auburn, on the other hand, they play in the West. They played very well in the West. Their only loss to LSU, and that was a strange game in that one. So I look at this number, and from a power rating standpoint, it's 1.5. And then I look at it in the betting market, and I see 2.5. And I'm thinking to myself, this seems low. You're coming off of an Iron Bowl win in which you were clearly the dominant team in that game. You're playing a team from the weaker division. Maybe there's a little bit of Georgia home field advantage factored in. I don't know. That could be the case. But this is such a tough game to sort of pinpoint and focus in on because, like I said, my number has the line a little bit high. My thought process has the number a little bit low. So I'm so conflicted on it. And at that point, it's probably best just to stay away.
Well, I think your competition, the level of competition you spoke about, is a great tool to look at. And, let's just look at the last 6 games for each team. What have these teams had to compete against down the stretch to get to the point they're at? Well, let's go over Georgia's schedule in reverse order. Georgia Tech, a game you didn't have to worry about, you won by 20. Kentucky at home, a game you didn't have to worry about, you won by 29 points. The game at Auburn, you lost. Season low 230 yards, season low 13 first down, season low 46 yards rushing. The South Carolina game was coming on. You were at home, though. And then you played Florida at neutral. And then you played Missouri at home. So your only games away from home were Auburn and Georgia Tech and Florida neutral. And then let's go back to Vanderbilt, Tennessee, and Notre Dame. So since the Notre Dame game, besides playing Auburn, there hasn't been a game within, I like looking at 5s. I like looking at a line between plus or minus 5 where you have a shot to pull the upset or you're a small favorite on the road, and only one game falls into that category. You look at Auburn, home against Bama, well, even though they were home, you could throw it in a good category. ULM, that's their bye week. Georgia at home, they took care of business. A&M on the road, they took care of business. Arkansas on the road, even though Arkansas is not great, I put Arkansas ahead of Georgia Tech, Florida, Vanderbilt, Tennessee, and then LSU. So to me, Auburn has passed the eye test, but unfortunately, this is a game that can come down to one injury. He is that valuable to the team, and any team that is a two-dimensional team, like most of your quality programs that have a chance to make the playoffs, if you take off one significant clog and make them one-dimensional or handicapped in one of those dimensions, they become ordinary very quickly.
I think what's really interesting is the way that previous matchups are considered here in these conference championship games. It certainly looks like Memphis and Central Florida wasn't really taken into account that much. North Texas and Florida Atlantic was. Akron and Toledo certainly has been, at least based on the line move. This is one where I feel like the previous meeting between the two teams wasn't really taken into account a whole lot because Auburn dominated that game. Now, did Georgia need that game? No, probably not. But at that point, given where they were in the college football playoff rankings, it's a game where they certainly wish that they would have shown better. They knew they were going to win the East, but, you give yourself a lot of breathing room if you can beat Auburn, in the spot that they were in. So it's kind of fascinating to me that it doesn't really feel like that game was incorporated into the line too much. Then you go to game 323, 324 here between Fresno State and Boise State, and last week's game is not incorporated into the number at all whatsoever. Now, that game meant nothing to either team. They knew that they were playing here in this spot. Fresno State won, still didn't win in terms of the computer formula that they used to determine home field here. So Boise State is at home on the blue turf, 8.5, 9-point favorite. And it makes me kind of wonder, were there signs in that game last week that show that Fresno State can play with Boise State? Does that game matter at all whatsoever? Right now, given where this number is, it looks like that game didn't matter at all.
Well, I think that the game mattered in my mind. I could be completely off, but going into the week, I believe Boise was prepping, was excited to play, and was ready for that game with the what-if scenarios. What if Memphis loses and then knocks off UCF? Then we would be the highest-ranked team to go into the group of 5 team. I believe they were talking that way. The newspapers had speculated they were in Idaho. Again, it probably wasn't going to happen. Memphis wasn't going to lose. But when you're a kid playing a game, we've seen anything can happen. So if you have a possibility of that happening, I think you start to think that. Well, that Memphis game was at noon, so it was clearly over before Boise even took the field. So, in my mind, I actually liked Boise early in the week, but it had to depend on the what if scenarios. And I think once they started to play, you saw them lose their focus and just not be the same team on offense or defense. But to me, in this game, I mean, it is night and day. Boise has been a horrible home favorite, on the Blue because they tend to lay so many more points than they should. But you look at Fresno this year, and there's no team in my mind that is more home-road dichotomy than the Bulldogs. At home, Fresno's average score is 35-13, and they're plus 138 yards per game. On the road, they're getting outscored 22-21, and they're getting outgained on the year as well. And the road games, granted they had those two big road games against Washington and Alabama early in the year, but then they played San Diego State. Then they pulled the upset against San Diego State. They beat San Jose State, and then Hawaii and Wyoming. So this is a game where Boise plays much better at home. Fresno plays much poorer on the road. You have the situation where you now have, it's very tough to beat someone in back-to-back weeks, especially when one was at home and one was on the road. And if the play calling, if Boise came out and they decided once they got down they didn't show anything because that win didn't matter, I have Boise as the better offensive team. I think Brett Rippon is, at 64%, he's got a 14-4 ratio. And Marcus McCarrion for Fresno, I mean, granted, he's 63% with a 12-3 ratio, but a lot of his passes came in blowout games where it didn't matter. Fresno played many more closer games. The Wyoming game was a 10-point game, and then they played BYU and Virginia. New Mexico was 14. Of late, even the Colorado State game was a 7-point game 3 weeks ago when they went into Colorado State and won. So Boise's only losses this year were at Washington State, were home to Virginia, and last week against Fresno State. So to me, they're laying a reasonable line with a situation to a team they just lost to last week, to a team they've dominated in the past, and against a Fresno State team that has to be disappointed. I mean, every other conference in America, if you have the same conference record and you win the head-to-head game, you host the championship. Well, the brain trust at the Mountain West, when they set up their title game, said, oh, let's not do that. Let's use 4 funky computer polls that no one's ever heard, and whoever has the lead on those can host the game. So I think while that could be a chip on the shoulder of Fresno State, I think they're also very disappointed to not have this game at home.
Yeah, I mean, my number on this game is more like 13. I actually have my number around 9.5, but with the home field advantage factored in, which Boise State does have, and like you said, they have been bad as a home favorite, so maybe the 3.5 I put on them right now is a little bit high, but in a spot like this, on the blue turf, obviously that's something that should benefit them. And what's interesting here is that this game has a little bit of extra college football playoff implications, which we'll talk about after we touch on this TCU-Oklahoma game. But if Fresno State wins this game, remains in the top 25, then you can sort of look at that game for Alabama and say, okay, well, maybe that strengthens Alabama's case a little bit. Should it? Probably not. But with the way that the College Football Playoff Committee works, the way that the formulas are figured out and all that type of thing, Fresno State beating Boise State here could have a pretty big impact on what Alabama's resume looks like if, we run into a situation where we're picking between Alabama and Ohio State. So that should be an interesting thing to watch. And like I said, we'll talk more about the College Football Playoff here in a couple of minutes after we discuss TCU and Oklahoma. Oklahoma touchdown favorite here in this one. Of course, this game also a rematch of one earlier on in the season. And like I said, that's one of the most interesting things for me to look at here with these conference championship games is how much is that previous meeting factored into the equation. And for TCU here, even though they lost 38-20, even though they were getting beat 38-14 at halftime, I still feel like that game is accurately incorporated into this number. I think this number is pretty decent.
The Sooners are the touchdown favorite, yes. And they, it's a game that Baker Mayfield has proven that he is Heisman worthy. And, Kenny Hill is very manageable. But, an 18-point win for Oklahoma, it was, it not only was a good win, it makes it very, very special to me because it came the week after they were at Oklahoma State. So, to me, you get an extra feather in your cap. You're beating TCU at home as expected. You do it the week after that crazy Oklahoma State game, and that proves to me that you can play as a team, distractions aren't going to bother you, and you are worthy to take your game to the next level.
I will say this, in terms of the games that are out there, the Miami-Clemson game, the Ohio State-Wisconsin game, I feel like if we've got a game that's going to throw things into college football playoff chaos, it's this one. I think this is the game where, honestly, no one's talking about TCU. And TCU is a really good football team. I mean, they were a top 15 team in my power ratings coming into the year. I kind of fought with myself as to whether or not I had them rated too high. And certainly with their body of work here so far with a 10-win regular season, I was validated in how high I had this team. They play the best defense of anybody in the Big 12. And that means something. I was talking in the previous segment with Philip Rossman-Reich during our NBA thing about the Portland Trailblazers and how in the Western Conference they play defense. They play a slower pace. They play defense. And we were talking about it a little bit last night with Stanford and how out there in the Pac-12 for football, they run the ball and play defense. And they've had a ton of success with it. And TCU is back to what it does best. Gary Patterson almost always has a good defense. And I feel like this is one of those spots, and I could obviously be very, very wrong because Baker Mayfield's a great player, but this feels to me like one of those games where nobody's talking about TCU, and it wouldn't surprise me if they were the right side all game long.
All right, well, here's a couple numbers for you to compare the offenses and defenses. Oklahoma's offense, clearly to me, is the best in football. They are number one in yards over average. So Oklahoma is gaining 205 yards more per game than their opponent allows. So put that in perspective. If that does hold true, TCU is allowing 318 yards, which is great. They'd be allowing 518. But looking at Oklahoma's performances, they had 9 season highs against their opponents. So when you look at an opponent and what they gave up, Oklahoma would be number one in 9 of their games. But on the flip side, down the stretch, TCU held Kansas State to a season low, held Kansas to a season low, held Iowa State to a season low, held Texas to a season low, held Texas Tech to a season low. Well, if they hold Oklahoma to a season low, Oklahoma had 469 yards against Kansas. So that all of a sudden makes it a game that can be much closer. Off topic, as we look, Oklahoma, of course, has 1 loss. TCU has 2 losses. We talked about in a previous game talking about Toledo head coach. Hats off to Matt Campbell because Iowa State, of course, beat both of these teams. So that just shows how much he has that Iowa State program going in the right direction. Off topic, of course, but just hats off to him. It's a game that, you're playing in Dallas, you're playing in a dome. Big 12 teams normally don't play in domes. It gives a unique situation. I think TCU in the Fort Worth area is going to have a crowd edge. We talked about the crowd edge in Atlanta, and I didn't really think they would have it. Oklahoma's going to fill every seat they can, but now you're in an area that you have that purple and white TCU around you. You have an area where they are TCU fans, and they already hate Oklahoma from the Texas-Oklahoma game, and now you add the TCU level in it. I actually do give TCU a 1.5-point home edge in this game for the locale of the game.
I honestly think that this is a game that could – we all kind of want college football playoff chaos because it just makes it fun. It makes it interesting to look at. And if Oklahoma loses this game, they're out. And, I think that of the dogs that are out there in that range, where there's college football playoff implications, obviously Georgia could win, but that wouldn't be that big of an upset. I don't know if Miami can beat Clemson because I don't know what Miami is. I don't think Wisconsin can beat Ohio State. I think Ohio State wins that game comfortably, as we'll talk about later in the week with another guest. But this is the one here to me. Like I said, you've got this dog nobody's talking about. You've got this favorite with the Heisman Trophy winner. You've got this prolific offense. I don't know. Something about this game just kind of stands out to me. So we'll see play out the way that it seems like it should. So I know you've got some strong college football playoff thoughts, and we'll wrap up today's show and today's segment with that. Why don't you fill our listeners in on what your thought process is here if we get to a situation where we're deciding between Ohio State and Alabama?
Well, it's now granted I was born and raised in Cleveland, so I followed Ohio State football my entire career. And am I a fan? Yes. And I understand the hate that Buckeye Nation gets because they are treated with it seems they get treated differently in scenarios. But this is just one of those ironic things to me this year that is just another thing that people can hate the Buckeyes for. And if you remember last year, we had the exact same situation. Penn State was a 2-loss team that won the Big Ten title, and the committee said, well, we think a 1-loss team, Ohio State, was better than you. So this year it's the complete opposite. You're going to have, if Ohio State wins, you're going to have a 2-loss Big Ten champion, which the committee did not allow last year, and they took a 1-loss team, which would be Bama. And they took grief for it. I mean, you had ADs that weren't even there at a conference that said that is just wrong. The committee, you're talking about how important a conference champion is. And to get to the conference championship and win the conference championship, that's what this playoff level is about. So all the hatred and all the hate mail they got last year for allowing Ohio State in is the exact opposite this year, and this would be the reason they have to put Ohio State in because they're a 2-loss Big Ten champion against a non-conference champion. So, clearly in football, ACC this year could have been a challenge for the best conference. I mean, it's been SEC forever, and it's Big Ten number 2 forever. And going into the year, I said, well, the ACC this year could have had a legitimate shot with Clemson and Miami and Louisville and Florida State to be the best conference in football. Well, we saw Louisville wasn't as good. We saw Florida State have injuries. So I would say the Big Ten is still the number 2 conference. If you have the number 2 conference in all of football and you don't allow their conference championship in, I think the committee gets bashed again. So why everyone hated the Buckeyes last year, that exact hatred could fuel them getting in this year to even hate them more. So that's my take on that. It's not something I'd bet a ton on. It's something that we'd have a bar bet on, and I would say, yes, I absolutely agree. It's just my point of opinion. You never know what the committee is going to talk about in the room. They may say, well, Ralph's full of crap. Alabama's the better team on paper. Let's put them in and screw the Big Ten. But you're setting a precedent if you're going to screw the Big Ten. And in my mind, I don't think they do that.
It's so incredible. And like we talked about, they just sort of fit the rules or fit the criteria to whatever narrative they want to achieve. And in this case, like you said, last year people feel like they had the wrong narrative by not taking the Big Ten champ. This year, they have the opportunity to flip that narrative and say, okay, well, this time we took the 2-loss Big Ten champion. What do you want from us? What should we do? So they can kind of have their cake and eat it too here in the sense that they can put in an Ohio State team. It's a huge financial draw, biggest financial draw in college football as far as I'm concerned, because like you talked about, they get a lot of hate. You love them, you hate them, but people watch them because they want them to lose or they want them to win, and they want to watch them lose. There are a lot of people out there that don't like Urban Meyer, a lot of people out there that don't like the silver spoon treatment that they'll say Ohio State gets. Big financial draw for you. Obviously, Alabama's a big financial draw because they've been the best team in college football for the last 10 years. So, I think it's a very interesting spot for them. I think it's a lose-lose spot for the committee in terms of the public perception of how it's treated. But I think in that room, it's a win-win because like I said, they can morph the narrative however they want. They can say, we didn't take the 2-loss Big Ten champ last year. You got mad at us. This year we did. You got mad at us. So, it's a lose-lose from a public perception standpoint. But within that room, And within, the minds of the decision makers who want to make money off of this thing, there really is no wrong choice probably between Ohio State and Alabama. Like you, I think Ohio State probably does get in, but they can use Alabama's strength of schedule to morph it, which is another conversation in and of itself, because when Alabama scheduled Florida State, nobody had any idea that Florida State would have to beat Louisiana Monroe in a game they added back to the schedule to get to a bowl game. Can Alabama be punished for that? I don't know. So these discussions are always fascinating, I think especially so this year.
One final note is I don't have the list in front of me who is on the committee, but I do know one person is on the committee, and it certainly helps having Gene Smith, the Ohio State AD, as one of the, what is the committee now, 11 or 12 people? So if 1/12 of that committee is the AD of Ohio State, it certainly can't hurt their case.
No, that's true, and I'm sure people don't like to hear that, but it just is a reality, and of course we'll revisit this here and see what the committee comes up with. But Rolf Michaels from WagerTalk.com, I know you produce a lot of really helpful guides, a lot of great betting tips for listeners out there. Why don't you tell us what you got going on?
The NBA stat sheet I put up daily is just a 2-page sheet which gives you how teams have done home and away, and the last 2 weeks both home and away, with average scores and average lines. I put a best bet in there daily. The best bets are now 8-1. You can follow me at CalSportsLV to get the link, or go to Wager Talk NBA News at 12 noon Eastern each day, and each report will have that night's games plus the next day in case you want to do your work overnight when they're starting to post the lines. You'll have that report as well. So at CalSportsLV or Wager Talk News and then NBA daily at noon Eastern.
Well, Rolf, as always, man, I appreciate your time. Thank you so much for helping me out here today, and we'll talk to you again on Thursday.
Thanks, bud. We'll talk to you. College hoops. Exciting. Thanks.